You set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land we celebrate music. In this land we celebrate games. In this land we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VG Embassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VG Embassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture. Or I may share a part of my culture on a solo show. And this is one of those much talked about but never actually occurring solo shows. It's been just about a year since I've done a solo show, back on episode 3 where I featured the SNES soundtrack to the game Hyperzone. This is going to be a little bit different. That solo show was mainly scripted and written out. This one's going to be a little more off the cuff, maybe a little bit more personal. I've decided to share with you guys my favorite composers as of June of 2019. Who knows who I'll discover going forward. But I felt like, the show's almost a year old now, and we've talked to so many amazing VG ambassadors and so many guests and so many incredible people on our Facebook group and on the Discord channel. And I want to share some of my culture with you guys, maybe so you have a little bit more of a perspective of where I'm coming from when I'm talking about game music and composers in the future. So this is going to be a 2-part series, and it's going to be 12 tracks each, 24 of my favorite composers total. And what I've done for these songs is I've tried to pick songs that are indicative of not only the composer's style, but what I like about these composers so much. For a few composers that are like really super popular, I've tried to pick some of the more obscure stuff so that you guys maybe can turn your ear towards something that you haven't heard before, even if it's a composer that you're well aware of. There might be some surprises in this show. Longtime listeners of Pixel Tunes and the VG Embassy might not be surprised for a lot of these. I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of composers right off the top of your guys' heads that you know will be in one of these 2 episodes. And speaking of that, so in fairness to the composers and fairness to myself, instead of going in ranking order from like least favorite to most favorite, because that would be really impossible and would probably generate way too much conversation of a negative tone on the social media groups, I've decided to put them in alphabetical order by last name. So we'll start at the top of the alphabet, and by the time we get to the end of episode 2, we'll be down in the, the Z's or whatever the last name begins with. I guess that brings us to our first composer. And this is a composer that I've been introduced to relatively recently. It hasn't been more than a couple years or so. He hasn't been on the scene for too long, and he mainly does mobile and indie games, and his name is near the top of the alphabet list, so some of you might already have a hint of who this is. Yeah, I'm talking about Norrin Radd, aka Matt Creamer. Just such an amazing guy overall, and such an incredible composer. He really loves to tackle different sound chips and give them his own brand of life and joy. And he's a great guy to talk to. He's extremely good at explaining his process. He was a guest on one of our episodes of Pixel Tunes Radio a while ago, and we had such a blast chatting with him, and I've had a great time interacting with him on Facebook since then. So he just released a new soundtrack to a game, and the story behind it's a little interesting. It's either called Emerald Eons or Ben 10 Heroes, depending on how you're looking at it. And we're going to play a track called Battle 2 from that game. This one just came out in 2019. It's for Android and iOS, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we come back. Oh, goodness me, that was Battle 2 from Emerald Eons and or Ben 10 Heroes, composed by Matt Creamer, aka Norin Rad. There's a lot of alternate names in this little segment here. Fantastic track. So much groove in this one. But before we get into talking about the music and a little bit more about Matt, here's a little trivia behind the actual release of this soundtrack. So from his Bandcamp, Matt wrote, Emerald Eons is sadly not a real game. This music was originally written for the Ben 10 Heroes mobile game. The owners of Ben 10 did not want the property to be used to sell any soundtracks, but were okay with me releasing the music on its own. So, he commissioned some artwork by the amazingly talented Pixel Licker, and he made his own fake Match 3 game concept instead, which is pretty darn cool, if you ask me. So if you want to hear this soundtrack while you're actually playing a game, go download Ben 10 Heroes, and you'll be able to listen to the soundtrack. I love the absolute groove in this track. Really, really nice bass line. Matt has a great handle on both melody and groove. You know, sometimes you get composers that are extremely melodic, and sometimes you get composers that can really put drums and bass together well, but then the melody seems a little bit anemic over the top. Matt just excels at both, and this is a great example of how he can combine both of those concepts into really, really good tracks. I haven't played the game yet, and this one is just called Battle 2, so I'm not sure how the music actually relates to what you're seeing on screen. What I do know, or what I can envision in my head, is this being played in any sort of game. I mean, this would be a great, like, level 1 for a run-and-gun shooter, or a really cool, like, cutscene or something like that. Being called Battle 2, I'm sure this is, you know, while you're actually in the middle of gameplay. A lot of his music, he will, so like for instance on the Treasure Buster soundtrack, he will take sampled sounds from FM sound chips. I think with Treasure Buster, it was primarily the Genesis sound chip, the YM2612, and he will create music from those samples, but using the rule set of the actual sound chip itself, so that it would sound like an authentic chiptune song. just composed in a tracker, like a mod tracker, instead of, using and the actual sounds coming from an emulated chip. Anyhow, Treasure Buster is an amazing soundtrack. Definitely one to check out if you haven't heard any of Matt Creamer's stuff. I originally found out about him through the game Venture Kid, which is very possible that my co-host on Pixel Tunes, Mike, originally saw because it looked so much like Mega Man. I'm not sure who discovered him first, but anyway, I really enjoyed it too. I looked up a lot of his other music and I fell in love with it. I was like, hey, this might be a really good guy to get on Pixel Tunes and, have a chat. But I had no idea, about his personality, if he would be a good conversationalist on the show. I looked up his YouTube channel and he had these amazing walkthroughs of how he created his music, and he spoke very well and very down to earth about the complicated things that he was doing to compose music, and I just felt that he would be a great fit with us on the show. And yes, it ended up being a fantastic show, and I recommend anybody who wants to know more about composing modern video games, or at least modern indie titles, to go check out that episode, because he was a wealth of information and extremely entertaining to boot. So all that put together makes him one of my favorite composers of all time. Let's move on to our next track. And I've spoken about this gentleman quite a few times, particularly when talking about really good industrial video game soundtracks. And he started off on a extremely popular PC title, and throughout his career he's elevated his craft and elevated his efforts to create extremely dynamic scores for some of the biggest video game titles out there. But his beginnings were very raw, I guess is the best term. We're going to be listening to a track called Crashed Up Again by Sasha Dikhizian, otherwise known as Sonic Mayhem. And this was on the original Quake 2 soundtrack, which came out on the PC in 1997, and was pretty much the soundtrack to my late teens. Alright, let's give it a listen. Alright, stop banging that head, put on that neck brace. And that was Crashed Up Again from Sasha Dikisian, otherwise known as Sonic Mayhem. And that was from the Quake 2 soundtrack, which came out on the PC in 1997, the year after I graduated high school. And yeah, pretty intense stuff. So I think I've spoken about this, maybe on VG Embassy, maybe in my nostalgia episode I did with Cam Worma, about being relatively disappointed when I found out that Trent Reznor was going to be doing the first Quake soundtrack, and was really excited to get the game and listen to the music in it because, hey, I was already into VGM, Nine Inch Nails was my favorite band of all time, smooshed the two together and it was like my dream, right? Ended up being a very ambient and not at all like Nine Inch Nails game soundtrack, so I was a little disappointed. But I really enjoyed Quake, went out and got Quake 2 probably the day it was released, or very, very close to it, and absolutely fell in love with this soundtrack. So this particular track combines a lot of elements of the grunge era with those wailing guitars at the beginning. It has a lot of kind of nu metal riffs in there, which, you know, it's a little embarrassing to say now, but back then in the mid-90s, like, that was the rage. Everybody was listening to Disturbed and Mudvayne and all that, and so was I. And it had some elements of industrial in there too, which I was also really into. So this soundtrack not only accompanied me through Planet Strogg, which I fought through on Quake 2 multiple times, but I was very pleased to learn that you could take the CD out of your computer, throw it in your audio CD player, and listen to all of the soundtracks in full stereo glory. So this was converted into cassette tape, thrown into my car, and played over and over and over again at the loudest volume possible with the windows down. Probably annoying everybody in my vicinity because I had a really crappy Ford Escort with terrible, terrible tinny speakers. But I didn't care, it was my car and I loved it. So, anyhow, this soundtrack was, like I said, the soundtrack of my late teens. It became a very good focal point for the music that I enjoyed going forward. And a lot of KMFDM's music was very similar to this, and I was a huge fan of them back then. A lot of the industrial rock that I listened to had a lot to do with some of the music that I listened to on Quake 2 and the Quake 2 expansion packs, which came out a little bit after this. And then after this, Quake 3 was released. Sasha Dikisian also made the music for that, and the music for Quake 3 was like straight up grindy, like Skinny Puppy style, industrial, really, really hard stuff. And I absolutely fell in love with that too. You know, the music in that wasn't... Let's just say I was trying to decide between playing a Quake 3 song and a Quake 2 song on the show, and I felt the Quake 2 music was a little more commercial friendly, ear friendly. Like the Quake 3 stuff is, you really have to be an industrial music fan to appreciate it. And I'm not trying to sound like some sort of industrial hipster here, but a lot of it's really grady, noisy stuff. And I wanted to kind of save your ears if you weren't really into industrial music that much. Anyway, Sasha Dikisian is a German composer, and Quake 2 was, I think, his first game. Besides Quake 3, he's also a composer on the Borderlands series, the newer Mortal Kombat games. He's written music for the Mass Effect series and Deus Ex. So he's gone on to do really cool, big things. He still keeps a little bit of the industrial stuff in his music sometimes, but, you know, he's gone into a lot of the cinematic and symphonic music as well. He's released some solo albums, which are absolutely incredible cinematic industrial music. And so if you like that stuff, definitely go check out Sonic Mayhem's website, and there'll be links to his solo non-VGM music there, and I think you'll get a really big kick out of it. Alright, so let's move on to our third composer of the day. And we're going to go very chiptune here, and probably pretty obscure too. This is a composer named Stello Dosis, and he only, at least in the major commercial markets, only released 2 games that most people have even heard of around here. And they were both Game Boy Color games, and they were both only released in Germany at that. But they had these incredible, absolutely incredible, hard-hitting demo scene style soundtracks. One was called Das Geheimnis der Happy Hippo Insel, and the other was Autofanten Kommando Stortebeker. And I've played a track at least from each one on Pixel Tunes and gushed about how much I loved them. But what a lot of people don't know is that Stella learned how to compose on the Commodore 64. And if you're a fan of the Impulse project, you might be aware that the SID chip is one of my favorite video game music sound chips. And so the combination of Stella and the Commodore 64 SID chip, it's pretty darn good. So, with that, I bring you the theme from Please. This came out on the C64 in 1993, composed by Stella. Alright, that was the theme from Police, released on the Commodore 64 in 1993. Kind of a block matching game, it seems. Looks like there's some patterns of blocks on the top of the screen, and then you have to put two of the same blocks together side by side by dragging them into each other, and then they disappear. And sometimes the blocks appear in such a way that you need to order them properly in order for them to be able to be put together and have them clear the board. So looks like a very interesting take on the matching game genre. Kind of a simple game for kind of an amazing track, and this is very indicative of a lot of Stelo Dosis's music. It's very mid to slow paced, a lot of incredible percussion. He loves thick snare hits and very, very heavy bass, and those are just obviously the keys to my heart. So he really hits all the right buttons when it comes to his chiptunes. Some of the music for the Game Boy Color games that he worked on were a little bit happier and bubblier than this, mainly because they were games made for kids based on German kids cartoons. Especially the music for Das Geheimnis der Happy Hippo Incel. You'd see a lot of really fun, bubbly tracks, but still they have this incredible, thick bass and really, really hard-hitting percussion section, which is not that common on Game Boy Color, especially the games. You know, you might hear it in the demo scene stuff coming out of the Game Boy Color nowadays, but not so much back then in the video games. I was originally kind of disappointed because I only thought that he had written those two Game Boy Color games, and that was kind of the extent of his musical contribution to chiptunes, but then I found out later on that he had a very prolific Commodore 64 career, working on a lot of independent games. Like this one was released in 1993. It was definitely not during the heyday of the C64. So this is more of probably like a demo scene to video game kind of concept, where a lot of sceners got together and were like, hey, let's create a video game and get a bunch of different sceners to do the art and the music and stuff. So they brought Stelo on to create the theme for this, and then the actual gameplay music was done by a different party entirely. So I really like this one because it's got kind of a slower pace, a really nice deep bass groove, almost feels a little bit like Jamaica dub, or like maybe has some like dubstep influences, and then as the song progresses, these incredible solos start to come out, and a lot of really unique sounding C64 instruments that you might not hear in other tracks. I think a lot of the reason behind that is because Stelo was also a pretty talented programmer as well, so he, especially for the Game Boy Color games, he wrote his own sound driver, and that allowed him to create a very unique sound when he was making his music. Unfortunately, the two Game Boy Color games that came out and all of the Commodore 64 games, they were all European exclusives, so before the dawn of high-speed internet, we didn't have access to any of these titles as kids, so his music was pretty much off limits to us unless you happen to know a European that brought over a PAL Commodore 64 and was able to play the game somehow on our electrical system. But nowadays, he is a commercial, graphic, and film production artist, and he has his own production company. He makes commercials and promos for TV and web. He does computer graphic design, plus filming and green screen, and combining CG with live action. If you go to his website, just look up Stelo Dosis on Google, you'll see a whole bunch of sizzle reels of projects that he's done. Most of the chiptune music he composed, he did while he was living in Germany, but since then he's moved to Australia and is now creating film and commercial productions for Australian television stations. Anyways, if you see his name linked to a Commodore 64 or a Game Boy Color track on your travels around the internet, definitely give it a listen. I think you'll really enjoy it, especially if you enjoyed this track from Police. Alright, moving on. So, it's still kind of early in the show, but I'm sure you guys are well aware that Tim Follin had to make an appearance at some point. And, as the alphabet goes, F comes a little bit after D. So, here he is in all his glory, Mr. Tim Follin, with the title theme from Lemmings. And this one came out on the PS2 and the PSP in 2006. I was debating on whether or not to play some chippy music from him or music from his later career. I decided to go with his later career because, as much as I love his chip music, I was very impressed with the production of his quote-unquote live-action instrumentation in the post-chiptune era. So let's take a listen to the title theme from Lemmings from Tim Follin, and we'll be right back. Yes, that song is so bittersweet for me. That was the title theme from Lemmings for the PSP and PS2, which was released in 2006, composed by Tim Follin. Bittersweet because this was the last game that Tim Follin composed for before retiring, and a really cool soundtrack too. Unfortunately, it wasn't a huge title. You know, it wasn't like going out with a bang. It was just this little title that could have been overlooked by so many people, and probably was, unfortunately, until I discovered the magic of Mr. Follin and voraciously ravaged every single soundtrack he's ever done as fast as I could. This soundtrack is kind of short and kind of sweet. It's got a lot of very thematic pieces of music on it because the Lemmings go through like Halloween Town and Rome and Egypt, and so he's composing all of these very deserty and, you know, kind of ancient sounding themes. The title theme really stood out because I think it sounds the most like his previous music. You know, he was always a really big fan of prog rock and 70s funk, and this track can take you right back to the 70s with like that Hammond organ and all the funky wah-wah guitar, some really nice drum work. On his live music, the production is just top-notch. It goes above and beyond what I've heard from most live music in video games of that era. And from what I understand, he did all of the audio production and most of the instrument performances himself. He was a multi-instrumentalist. So what you're hearing is not only, you know, him playing around on different instruments, but his recording techniques, his mastering techniques. You know, it's like the whole package. He was too talented for video games, and I'm glad that he was able to find success outside of video games. And I'm so glad that he was able to work on so many titles before that we have this kind of wealth of incredible music that we can enjoy from him. So, I don't know, I really like this one because it's short and it's sweet. It shows off a lot of his talent at groove building with a little bit of melody, and then you think the song's kind of looping, but then it goes into this great Follin solo at the end before the actual loop. And for a title theme on a PSP game, it's like, who's going to stick around and listen to that much music? You know, people are just going to probably click right through. It's Lemmings. You're probably going to have people that aren't really that into VGM playing this game, for the most part. He's always really pushed every single system he's worked on to its limits, and maybe he just put in more effort than he should have and didn't get the return back, which is why he ended up retiring. I don't know. Anyhow, if you want to hear more about Tim Follin, he's done numerous interviews on different podcasts over the past couple of years. I think he's been on the Mercado Brothers. I think he did an interview with Legacy Music Hour, and I also did 2 episodes focusing on him on Pixel Tunes Radio. Coincidentally, episodes 69 and 96, I did not plan that to happen, but it just worked out, so it's really easy to remember. So you can check those out. I went chronologically, so Volume 1 is all of his really early stuff from the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, and then Volume 2 was stuff that the North Americans might have been more familiar with, so Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, and then moving on to the post-chiptune systems, Dreamcast, PSP, etc. Many, many times I've referred to him as my favorite composer ever, and I haven't yet found anyone to knock him off the top spot. But there are a few that come very close, and the next composer is somebody who I also hold in very high regard, especially for his compositions on the Sega Genesis and his work in FM music, and that is another British gentleman by the name of Matt Furness. And we're going to be listening to a track from Predator 2. This is Stage 1, The Streets, from the Genesis, and this game came out in 1992. Let's hit it. Speaking of groove and really nice bass, that was Stage 1, The Streets, from Predator 2 for the Genesis. And that was a 1992 Matt Furness composition. And it was really hard to pick a Matt Furness track that I haven't already shared on Pixel Tunes or VG Embassy. I've played so much music from him in the past, especially our episode of Pixel Tunes, episode number 82, which we had him on as a guest, and we just burned through a ton of his soundtracks and talked at great length about his composition process and what it was like to work on some of the games that he wrote the music for. You know, as a kid, I just coincidentally happened to avoid every single game he'd ever written music for, which is kind of funny. I mean, he didn't work on the Super Nintendo at all, and I had the Super Nintendo for the majority of the 16-bit era. But even when I did get a Genesis, I got a whole bunch of games, but none of the games that I had were titles that he had worked on. So I didn't find out about his music until much, much later. And as I started to fall in love with FM music, I, of course, got exposed to his soundtracks as well and found them to be absolutely remarkable and unique, because there weren't that many Western composers working in FM that really had a handle on the sound chip like he did. And again, just like Tim Follin, he was pretty prolific. He has a lot of games to his name. I think he just really enjoyed writing music and had his own custom sound driver written by his partner in crime, Sean Hollingworth. And as we talked a little bit about in the episode that we did with him, he was able to listen to the music as he wrote it in real time as it came out of the Sega Genesis sound chip. So he could literally fine-tune every note, every sample, every instrument to make sure it sounds exactly the way that he wants. And I think it worked out to great effect for him. This particular track is really cool. It's got some great drum work with some very clear sampled snares, a nice little bass groove, and then a little bit of melody coming in. I think this is a little more stripped down than a lot of Matt Furness's other compositions on other games, but I like this one because it kind of lets you hear all the other parts without other instruments kind of getting in the way. So you get a little bit of drum and bass, and then you get a little bit of one melody in one instrument, and then another little solo with another instrument, and then it kind of all like tightly wraps itself up and comes back into the loop again. It's one of those kind of songs that you can kind of put on in the background and do other things to and not have to get up to change it because it's getting annoying. It's just a nice background loop to chill out to. He's more or less retired from video game composition. I think he's currently working at Sony on their PlayStation streaming services, which is really cool. He worked on the title music for Fear Effects Sedna, which we were very pleased to be able to feature on that episode of Pixel Tunes and kind of get the behind the scenes of how he wrote that song. But all in all, a really good guy. He's very active on social media. He's always happy to talk about his work and the technical aspects of composing on the Amiga and the Genesis, which were his two primary tools of choice when he was writing tunes. So let's move on to our next composer that I'm sure you guys knew would have a spot in this podcast. This is a gentleman who's composed lots and lots of really, really good Game Boy and Game Boy Color music. I've spoken at length on both Pixel Tunes and VG Embassy about his quote-unquote signature bounce, and that would be none other than Mr. Alberto Jose Gonzalez. Again, this was hard to find a track from a game I haven't featured on a podcast before, but I did find one really cool one. This is the theme song from a game called Pop-Up, which was known as Cool Ball in Japan. This came out on the Game Boy in 1991. We'll be right back. Alright, that was the theme from Pop-Up for the Game Boy that came out in 1991. In North American regions, the game was called Cool Ball because US in the 1990s, everything's got to be cool or extreme, right? That was composed by Alberto Jose Gonzalez. And the neat thing about this is that, so I just shared Tim Follin's last VGM soundtrack, and this is Alberto Gonzalez's first Game Boy soundtrack, and he's pretty much most famous for his amazing Game Boy soundtrack, so it's very cool to be able to listen to where it all began, and it sounds extremely competent for his first outing on the Game Boy. I found this track uploaded on his own personal SoundCloud, and he had a couple personal notes about the track, and he wrote, "My first commercial tune for the Game Boy, released in the US as Cool Ball. The game was only 32 kilobytes in size, just like Bomb Jack, but very entertaining. It only had this tune and a small jingle for the game over. I was doing mandatory military service and composed this tune in a weekend off. I remember how amazed I was about the new possibilities of the Game Boy sound, especially the noise channel and the pseudo stereo, compared to the 8-bit computers I used until then." Before this, he was mainly composing on the ZX Spectrum, which only had 3 channels and much more limited sound palette than the Game Boy, so I can imagine he would feel much more free to do what he wanted to, and I think it really took advantage of what the Game Boy sound hardware was capable of with this tune. Some really nice arpeggios, a little like call and response melodies in there, which was really neat. He's kind of experimenting with different instruments, which were a little more limited on the ZX Spectrum. I really feel like he was kind of like putting the sound hardware through its paces at the same time as trying to make a song that was entertaining enough to listen to. I mean, this game has like 99 levels of a single screen, and you're kind of bouncing this ball through platforms and trampolines and trying to collect all the widgets scattered around the screen to finally beat each level. And there's like 99 levels of this, and this is the one song that plays throughout the entire game, so it's got to be a good one, or you're going to get really, really bored of it. Gonzalez was another composer that I discovered very late in life. For a few years, I was maintaining a forum thread on the Final Fantasy Shrine forums, and it was basically like a VGM request thread. Like, people would just come into the forum and be like, "Can you upload the soundtrack to XYZ game in MP3 format?" And I would research the game and see if I could find the files for it, and if, the VGM ready-to-go sound files weren't already available, I'd look at the game itself or the CD image, and I'd try to extract the music from it and convert it into MP3 somehow. And so that was where somebody suggested, I think it was Turok Rage Wars. They said, "Can you upload that in MP3 format?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure. I've never heard of this composer before, but I'll go ahead and do it." And I took a listen to the music and was like, whoa, this is mind-blowing. Like, I'd never heard Game Boy music like that before. And that was right around the time that I was doing Pixel Tunes Radio, and I remember sharing it on Pixel Tunes, and Mike was just as blown away as I was. And from then on, we both kind of, just like Tim Follin's music, we just kind of went through his entire collection of like, what else did he do? We gotta listen to more stuff. And every single game were like, incredible, incredible, incredible. We just couldn't talk about it and share it enough. Alberto himself is a fantastic guy. I've talked to him a few times via Facebook, and I've listened to a couple of interviews that he's done with other podcasts, and super, super knowledgeable. He's not only a composer, but he's a programmer, so he's still working in the industry today, and he's making mobile games and computer games and doing ports from mobile games into computer games. He's working with Abbey Light Studios, and they're doing stuff with augmented reality on the iPhone. He's doing some short little snippet kind of mobile game soundtracks as well. A lot of like really textured electronic dance music in a lot of his newer stuff. I really like that stuff too, but the chiptune stuff is just absolutely classic and kind of what I always return to when I want to listen to some of his music. You can check out his tunes on Lucky Luke, like I said, Turok Rage Wars on the Game Boy, a lot of the Asterix and Obelisk games, Tintin in Tibet, What else was there? Smurfs is obviously one of his most famous and most well-produced soundtracks on the Game Boy. So check him out if you're not familiar with him. He's got so much music, such happy, bouncy, melodic music with such texture. I think he probably has the most handle on creating texture and vibrancy on the Game Boy sound hardware that I've heard come out of anybody, demo scene or VGM composer alike. So a super great talent, and I'm so glad that he's still making music and sharing older stuff that he's composed to this day. Okay, let's go in a completely different direction here. We're going to go from super old, bouncy, happy chiptune to gritty, hardstyle streaming audio from a very modern game. Yeah, this is Mick Gordon, and I'm sure Alex Messenger's out there right now going, yeah! He's, I guess, came into the limelight with the Killer Instinct game, the new one that was on the Xbox One and PC, and then he composed the music for the new revival of Doom, which came out in 2016, an absolutely phenomenal soundtrack. He continued to work with id Software, and he wrote some music for Wolfenstein 2: The Next Colossus. And so we're going to listen to Der Citadel, which is the Manhattan boss fight theme from Wolfenstein 2. This one was released on PC, PS4, Xbox One, etc. in 2017. Strap in. This is a heavy one. Oh, man. Alright, that was Der Citadel, the Manhattan boss fight theme from Wolfenstein 2, the next Colossus, the PC, PS4, Xbox One release from 2017, composed by Mick Gordon. So I love hacking and modifying stuff and doing weird things to consoles, and I think that's why I love industrial music so much. I love listening to sounds in a song where I can't figure out how they made that. Like, there's some sort of trickery going on. Like, the breakdown in this song, for instance, like, is that a guitar? Is it a keyboard? Did they record a sample of somebody sneezing and then slowed it way down? Because it could very well be that too. It's a brain bender, but it also sounds so damn cool. And Mick Gordon is really good at doing amazing, like, really hard stuff to make you want to bang your head, but it's also very ambient and sets the mood and the tone so well. He's not just your typical industrial music composer. He really knows how to create space and mood. And I haven't played Wolfenstein 2 yet, but I can, I've seen video clips of it, and I can definitely see how the music in this fits the mood very well. So my buddy Joe from Embassy Exclusive is letting me borrow his PSVR helmet, and he also let me borrow the VR edition of Doom for the PS4, which he wrote the music to. And let me tell you, so, you've got the VR headset on, and then I've got the headphones over that, so I'm just kind of like completely strapped in. Audio, video, it's all just wrapped around my head. And playing Doom and just being able to like whip your head around and then see these monsters coming, and as the monsters are coming, the dynamic Doom soundtrack, the guitars and the drums are just kind of welling up around your head, and as you turn your head, the guitars are like moving from side to side, and his music just fits so well, and I love that about him. He's done a lot of stuff for the Killer Instinct series too, and those are a little more traditional style industrial songs. I love them too, but Doom and Wolfenstein and his first-person shooter music is like absolute top-notch. I could not imagine those games with any other soundtrack other than his music. So Doom Eternal is going to be coming out very soon. They just announced it a little while ago and then showed some more footage of it at this recent E3 2019. And I am really looking forward to the game, but just as much as I'm looking forward to the game, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to listen to more amazing Mick Gordon music. So keep it up, dude. Little coincidence, kind of related to the podcast. At the Video Game Awards show, I think it was in 2017, maybe the year after Doom came out, Mick Gordon did a live set of some Quake 2 music, some Doom music, a lot of the stuff that he worked on, and it was really awesome for me because, so he's on stage front and center, he's playing guitar, he's running around, they're playing all these really awesome Doom songs, and then you look in the background and they didn't really announce that he was there, but on keyboards is Sasha Dikisian, and then they're doing Quake 2 music, so I was like, this is double awesome because I'm getting live Quake 2 music performed by the composer, and then Doom music performed by its composer. I was just in hog heaven for like that 7 minutes that they were on stage together. So look that up, check that out on YouTube. It's supremely amazing performance, especially if you like both of these composers. It's quite a treat. All right, so this show has had a notable lack of Japanese composers, and I don't know, my predilections tended more towards Western composers. It seems that as I listen to more and more VGM, I tend to appreciate more of the Western stuff, whether it be chiptune or streaming or whatever. So the rest of the show is actually going to be pretty Japanese heavy, and we're going to start off with a gentleman who we actually dedicated an entire episode of Pixel Tunes to at one point when we covered the soundtrack to Undercover Cops, Takushi Hayamuda. Now, I don't think we've ever played anything from Cosmic Cop, otherwise known as Armed Police Unit Gallop. So we're going to play a selection from that today, and the track is called The Funky Flamingo, otherwise known as Zone A. This was an arcade release that came out in 1991. Alright, that was Funky Flamingo, which plays in Zone A of Cosmic Cop, or Armed Police Unit Gallop. That was a vertical shooter that came out in the arcades in 1991. The soundtrack was composed by Takushi Hayamuda, who is otherwise known by his alias Haya Unit. And I first learned about Hayamuta-san when I first got my SNES, and one of the first games I got was Super R-Type, which he composed the soundtrack to. And I loved that soundtrack so much. Some of you might remember that I used to record video game soundtracks to tape via my home stereo, which I hooked my Super Nintendo up to back in the day. And I would just pop those cassettes in my Walkman and listen in the car as my parents drove us from place to place, and so I didn't have to deal with them. But the Super R-Type soundtrack was one of these soundtracks that I listened to over and over and over. It had so much element of rock and funk and metal and New Jack Swing. It had a fantastic instrument set. Man, it was just really good. It incorporated all of the themes of the original arcade R-Type and just pumped it up a notch, a very stylistic notch. And Hayamura really knew what he was doing. I mean, you can tell this is, I think, the first game he ever composed for, commercially at least. And it's got a really, really nice bass line, some extremely complex, funky drumming going on, and some nice melodies over it. This is a very fast-paced shooter, and obviously, arcade games need to attract people to them so they can start throwing quarters in. And I think the music in this game definitely fits that. It's not quite the level that like Undercover Cops is on. If you've heard his arcade soundtrack for that, it's like one of the pinnacles of FM music, in my opinion. Anyway, it's amazing. But then after that, he went on to do a lot of stuff for SNK and the Neo Geo. He composed a lot of the music for the Metal Slug series and Neo Turf Masters. He wrote a fantastic golf soundtrack for that game. I don't know if there's a soundtrack he's worked on that I haven't really enjoyed. And a lot of it was before I even knew who he was. There happened to be a couple of soundtracks out there I enjoyed, and then I was able to connect the dots when I finally learned who was behind them all. So, Takushi Hayamura is a guy to look out for sure. Alright, so let's move on to another Japanese composer. And if you remember the episode on drum and bass that I did with Rob Nichols a few episodes ago, I kind of spoke at length about how I got into dance and techno and electronic music, and a big influence on that was the Ridge Racer soundtrack, composed by one Shinji Hosoe. So, of course, with that much influence on my life and how much he changed my taste in music, he's got to be in the show, right? So, instead of playing something from Ridge Racer, which everybody's heard before, we're going to play a track from Ridge Racer 7, which came out in 2006. I think it was a PS3 exclusive, if I'm not mistaken. This is a track called Combustion, and this track also appeared on Ridge Racer Slipstream, which was a mobile Ridge Racer game, and Ridge Racer on the 3DS as well. And it made it into all three games because it's freaking cool. So, we'll be right back in a bit. Yes, that was Combustion from Ridge Racer 7, which came out of the PS3 in 2006, composed by Shinji Hosoe, otherwise known as Sampling Masters Mega. And the Sampling Masters are a collective, or were a collective, of Namco sound designers and composers who turned out some absolutely amazing techno and dance music from the mid-90s till very, very recently. So Shinji Hosoe has been with the Ridge Racer series since the very beginning. He was the sole composer on the first few Ridge Racer games, and then was joined by a few other artists as time went on. I think he contributed 1 or 2 tracks to Ridge Racer 7, and I chose Combustion because it's a very split personality track. It starts off kind of like industrial techno, and then goes full-on dance, and then there's like this rock metal breakdown which comes out of absolutely nowhere, just seamlessly transitioning from one style to the other, and then goes into like some sort of a house beat with the guitars from the rock portion still in the background, and he's blending those two, and then it just ends up kind of more like trance towards the end, and it's just kind of flowing back and forth. And if you're listening to this track while you're racing around in your Ridge Racer car, you're probably not even going to realize that you're listening to so many different genres at once. It's just going to sound like a really hard pumping kind of tune that's going to make you want to travel as fast as you can. Yeah, Shinji Hosoe's got a very good talent for that. I think the fact that he was the composer that introduced me to electronic music was a blessing and a curse, because he's so good at it that when I started looking through CD racks at my local record stores, the stuff that I was finding was good, but it wasn't ever as good as Shinji Hosoe's stuff. He's just so top of the pile as far as dance music goes, in my opinion, that the one-off songs from, local DJs and producers on a lot of these compilations just couldn't hold a candle to the stuff that Shinji Hosoe was doing. And it's because he's not only just a dance music producer and can do DJ stuff, but he's also a full-fledged composer. Like, he's done symphonic soundtracks, he's written rock songs, he's written just straight-up kind of electronic VGM, which is just very melodic and holds an actual tune and doesn't have anything to do with dance music. So when he creates music for Ridge Racer or wants to do something in the dance genre, he can incorporate all of his classical composition skills into that and make music that sounds interesting and melodic, but also will get you out on the dance floor and bumping and grinding. So, one of the unique talents of Shinji Hosoe. Speaking of uniquely talented, let's move on to our next composer. For Europeans, this guy probably needs no introduction whatsoever. For the North American crowd, he's probably a little less well known, but I'm sure most people who are interested in VGM as a whole have heard of him before. This is the title theme from International Karate, which came out on the C64, as well as a whole bunch of other European computer systems in 1986. And this is composed by the venerable Mr. Rob Hubbard. Rob Hubbard. Rob Hubbard. My oh my. So, you gotta keep in mind that you hear music like this a lot on the Commodore 64. Nowadays, the demo scene in terms of Commodore 64 music is pretty ripe with very talented composers and lots of music and lots of individuals who are pushing the SID chip to its absolute limits. A lot of the music sounds very similar to what Rob Hubbard is doing here in the title theme to International Karate, which, by the way, came out on the C64 in 1986. And that date is significant. 1986. He's doing what people are doing now in 1986. And the people are only doing it now because Rob Hubbard set the standard in 1986. Intermittent noise used as percussion and quickly changing a channel's instrument back and forth to different sounds to make it sound like there's more than just 3 channels on the SID chip, combining the drums and an instrument on the same channel, creating really long songs. I think this track is like 11 minutes long, and I've spared you the entire tune. If you enjoy it, please go check it out on YouTube. You will find several very high-quality versions of the track there. But, that being said, my previous statements about wanting to push hardware to its limits and kind of hacking things to make them do what they weren't originally supposed to do, Rob Hubbard was very instrumental in doing that for the SID chip and for Commodore 64 music, and his influence knows no bounds in terms of the composers that came shortly afterward and the hobbyists and demo scene composers that came way afterward. So he definitely belongs in a spot on this show because we owe him a large debt of gratitude for helping shape video game music, especially chiptune, into what it is today. And again, a super prolific artist. Tons and tons of Commodore 64 music. If you look up his name, just search his name on YouTube and you will find video after video after video of amazing music composed by him. He got very, very popular and EA took an interest in him. And so when the Super Nintendo versions of like Madden, football, and like Bulls vs. Blazers and the NBA basketball games were coming out, Electronic Arts asked Hubbard to move to the States and start composing music for the Super Nintendo for their sports games. So it was really cool to kind of have access to his music without really knowing how big he was when we were kids. And it's also kind of a shame too, because while the music for his Super Nintendo compositions were good, you could tell that the sound driver he was working with and the tools that he had to use just weren't up to snuff. And so his music sounds a little bit stilted, and any other listener might think that this composer might have been struggling with writing music and that they might have been kind of new at it. But given the fact that Rob Hubbard has hundreds of hours of music experience under his belt, pre-Super Nintendo era, we really have to blame it on probably the software and the tools available to him. But still, go check out his Super Nintendo stuff. You may enjoy it. His Commodore 64 stuff is far and away what he's most well known for, and deservedly so. Alright, heading towards the home stretch. We got a couple more composers left. Next on our list is one Naoki Kodaka. And I'm going to play a couple selections, because they're kind of short. This is from a relatively unknown game for the Famicom that he composed for, called Nentetate Baseball. This was released in 1990, and these are songs 10 and 16. I didn't have track names for them, unfortunately. The game is that obscure. So let's take a listen to these two. We'll be right back. Okay, those were songs 10 and 16 from the soundtrack from Nentetate Baseball, which came out on the Famicom, Japan only, in 1990, composed by Naoki Kodaka. Alright, so song number 10 is a short, quick little loop, but that kind of shows off his heavier side. He had a lot of thrashy metal kind of influences when he was creating his music, and I really enjoy the super fast drums in this one. It definitely creates a feeling of tension. I want to imagine that perhaps this song would probably play when the bases were loaded and it's like the bottom of the ninth and there's one run in between the two teams and it's all down to the wire. So this song might appear during a sequence like that. Song number 16, the second song, when I first heard it, I right away noticed that Sunsoft bass sample, which Naoki Kodaka's music is absolutely famous for. It's kind of his textural trademark. But the other thing that I noticed is how much it sounds like something from like Mr. Gimmick, which wasn't even composed by him, but it had that very kind of happy flavor. It's in the same key, it's using the same bass sound in the same kind of melodic style. So I noticed that right away and was very happy to hear that. And this is a soundtrack that I think very few people even know exists, especially attributed to a composer like Naoki Kodaka, who's probably one of the most popular NES composers around. And I think he's probably one of the most popular ones because his sound is so unique, because whether Sunsoft made the decision to, or whether he made the decision to dedicate the sample channel on the Famicom hardware to use as a bass note instead of a drum sound or a vocal sound effect in his games, he decided to create melody with that sample channel. That's just such an ingenious move. And not only that, but, he could have done that and created some mediocre songs that maybe sounded a little bit different, but no, his compositions are incredible too. Combined with that very unique sound, I think really made him stand out as a composer among a lot of the other contemporaries that he was composing alongside from different video game companies. So, yeah, I think I first heard his music on Fester's Quest when I rented it, and if any of you have played Fester's Quest, it starts off kind of simple. There's a little cinematic where like a UFO comes down and beams something up from the Addams Family house, and Fester's glasses go up, and it's really cheesy, but the music in the background is like, do, 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 do. It sounds like kids' music, but then the title screen comes up, and it's like all the channels are blasting at once. You've got crazy bass going with the sample channel. The screen is flashing along to like the heavy beats in this like super New Jack Swing style Addams Family theme song remix. Super cool stuff. And at that point I knew that whatever music I could find in that game was going to be recorded onto tape so I could listen to it in perpetuity. And that I did, so I became much more familiar with the soundtrack than I did with the game, because I had to return the game, but the cassette tape stayed at my house for years. But yeah, every other soundtrack I've heard by him has been absolutely phenomenal. There isn't a single thing he's written that I've been like on the fence about. So he does definitely take the place of one of my favorite composers of all time. Aside from Nante Tate Baseball, which was kind of a surprise to me when I was kind of looking for obscure stuff, there's not much else out there that I haven't heard from him. So I'm pretty confident that I can say that his entire collection is top-notch in my book. Definitely worth checking out. Alright, let's move on to our last composer of Volume 1. And what a great one to close out with. We're going to listen to a track from Yuzo Koshiro. And this one's called What Are Hunters? And this one is from a 3DS game called 7th Dragon 3 Code VFD. This one came out in 2015. We'll be right back. What Are Hunters? Composed by Yuzo Koshiro for the game 7th Dragon 3, code VFD. And that was a 3DS release from 2015. Yeah, you know, I don't know much about the games. I know that they are RPGs. I played a track from 7th Dragon 2020, which was another game in this series, on Pixel Tunes. Another incredible track, and researched a little bit of it, but they just don't seem like games that I would particularly be that into. But the soundtracks, oh my god. I mean, just listen to this one. Great melody, great hooks. Very similar to Combustion from Shinji Hosoe. You've got a lot of different sounds and movements within the electronic genre. There's a little bit of industrial in here. There's some like almost rock elements and some straight up dance elements. Some great kind of house keyboards playing some very catchy melodies that you just kind of hum to yourself afterwards. Yuzo Koshiro's great for that, and he knows his dance music so well. But he not only can compose and dance, but he will do symphonic, and he will do rock, and he will just do your traditional kind of medieval style RPG town music and pull them off with such panache and confidence that you would swear that they were 3 or 4 different composers. Obviously, he became most famous when he was working on the Genesis in the United States with the Streets of Rage soundtrack, and then moved on to some Super Nintendo music for ActRaiser, which was incredible as well. I grew up with his music. I didn't really know it was him at the time. I knew that in Streets of Rage, on the title screen, it said music copyright Yuzo Koshiro, so there was a name behind that soundtrack, but I wasn't aware that he was making music for other games that I have played that I was also a big fan of. So, yeah, when I was able to tie it all together, I had a brand new appreciation for what Koshiro did. And much like Rob Hubbard on the C64 scene, Yuzo Koshiro was the same for FM music in Japan. And whether he was working on Sharp X68000 games like Mosconian, or PC98 and PC88 games like The Scheme, he was creating music that was far and away more advanced, more melodic, more listenable than a lot of the other composers out there. And so other guys like Ryu Takami, Ryu Umemoto, Yuki Nakayama, they all kind of saw what he was doing and wanted to improve themselves to get to his level. And so you started seeing a big resurgence of incredible FM music being made on these systems that already had some incredible FM sound chips and sound cards available. So, yeah, Yuzo Koshiro, I mean, it's probably no secret that he's one of my favorites. I think he's a lot of people's probably top 10 composers. You really can't deny his talent and his ability to create amazing music that just stands on its own incredibly well, but also fits the game incredibly well. And that's hard to do, where you can listen to a soundtrack by itself, and even if you're not a VGM fan, still enjoy the hell out of it, but also have it be part of the total package of a video game and just have it fit like you couldn't imagine any other music in there. So, yeah, Koshiro's still making music to this day. I'm very excited for the Genesis Mini to be released, Sega's answer to the PlayStation Classic and the NES Mini. Yuzo Koshiro will be writing the menu music that plays while you are selecting your game, and from what I understand and from what he's said, he will be remixing portions of the soundtracks from the games that are included in that Genesis Mini and creating a medley in FM with those songs and kind of mixing them together, and that will be the background music for the Genesis Mini selection screen. So I'm really excited to get a rip of that song once it finally releases. I think hearing his take on like Thunder Force 3 and Echo the Dolphin and a lot of the other games that are in those collections is going to be something that I really, really don't want to miss. Alright guys, so that does it for Volume 1. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you maybe learned something new, maybe learned something about me. I'd love to hear your comments about what you thought about my song selections, if you think that they are indicative of the styles of the composers, if I got that part right. Maybe there are some other tracks out there that you think might be a good example of what these composers have written and contributed to VGM over the years. I hope you maybe have some of these composers on your list as well. And don't forget, we're only halfway through. We've got 12 more coming in Volume 2, which will be airing very soon. It might be the next episode, it might be the episode after that. I'm not sure. I've got a VG ambassador stopping by in a couple days to record a episode at the embassy, so depending on when I can get Volume 2 done depends on how quickly we'll be hearing that. As a little teaser though, I'll give you a few hints of composers that you might be hearing. You might be hearing some music from Jesper Kyd. You might be hearing some music from Hideki Naganuma. You might be hearing some music from Akira Yamaoka. I mean, of course, that last one's obviously a given. So some of the other ones might be a surprise. Some of the other ones might be fairly obvious, but I think I've got a good collection of composers for Volume 2 that you guys will absolutely enjoy. So, as always, I'd like to thank Indira for the art and Trevin Hughes, otherwise known as Dread, for the podcast theme song. And you can find us on Facebook. Head over to facebook.com/groups/TheVGEmbassy, and there you can find where this post is located, and leave comments on what you thought about the show. You can also head over to Twitter @TheVGEmbassy and Instagram @TheVGEmbassy. You can find our website at thevgembassy.com. And at the top of the page, there are two very important links. The first link is to our Discord group, which is full of daily activity. People posting songs, people talking about the shows, people just sharing their day-to-day stuff in the off-topic section. If you don't have social media and you are on Discord, go check us out. It's an open invite. You don't need to jump through any hoops to get accepted into the group, and we'd love to chat with you about the show. The other link at the top of thevgembassy.com is our Patreon page, and there you can check out the Patreon tiers. Maybe you'd like to contribute a little bit of your hard-earned cash to the show to help me offset the cost of hosting and all of this really cool equipment that I'm using to upgrade to allow more people to come on simultaneously and share their culture with me. Speaking of which, I would like to thank our Patreon patrons at the Taurus level. There's Shoryu Kenny, Cameron Childs, and Michael Bridgewater from the Forever Sound Version podcast. Our VG emissaries, Chris Murray, Chris Myers, Donovan Orofino, Ben the Dyad Dishman, John Jekyll, Chris Steenerson, Jordan Worma from the Table to Stage podcast, and Volt Supreme. Our audio attaché members, Cameron Worma, Carlito from the Heroes 3 podcast, and Scott McElhone. And lastly, our VG ambassador, the patron saint of VGM podcasts, Alex, the Messenger. If you are listening on iTunes, please feel free to drop over to the VG Embassy iTunes page. Drop us a few stars in the ratings, and maybe type up a little review if you like what you hear. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show, and people that are interested in listening to VGM podcasts. It makes a great amount of difference if they can read some very positive reviews of my little VGM show here. All right, so again, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it, as always. And we'll see you in 2 weeks with a show that may or may not be Volume 2 of my favorite composers. But if it isn't, it's still going to be something really sweet anyways. So, alright. Take care, guys.